Tell me about a time you wrote technical documentation introduction. This is a common behavioral interview question for software developers, backend developers, full-stack developers, senior developers, and team leads. Interviewers ask this question to understand how clearly you communicate technical information, how you make complex systems easier to understand, how you support onboarding and knowledge sharing, how you document APIs, architecture, and operational procedures, how you reduce dependency on individual team members, how you keep documentation accurate and maintainable, how you improve development and production support. This question is especially important for Java developers, backend developers, Spring Boot developers, full-stack developers, senior software developers, team leads, DevOps teams, Agile teams. The best way to answer this question is by using the STAR method. STAR means S. Situation. Explain the background. T. Task. Explain your responsibility. A. Action. Explain what you personally did. R. Result. Explain the final outcome. A good interview answer usually spends 10% situation, 10% task, 60% action, 20% result. The most important part is the action section because interviewers want to understand how you identified the audience, organized the information, verified accuracy, and made the document useful. Question: tell me about a time you wrote technical documentation. Example 1. Writing API documentation for a Spring Boot service situation. In one project, our team developed a new Spring Boot REST API for customer search. The API supported filters, pagination, sorting, validation, authorization, and different error responses. Front-end developers and QA needed clear documentation to integrate with and test the API. Task: I was responsible for documenting the API contract and making sure other teams could use it without repeatedly asking developers for clarification. Action: I first identified what front-end developers and QA needed to know. I documented color, endpoint URL, HTTP method, authentication requirements, request parameters, required and optional fields, validation rules, response structure, pagination behavior, sorting options, error codes, authorization rules. I included sample requests and responses for check valid search, check empty result, check invalid filter, check invalid sorting, check unauthorized request, check forbidden request, server error. I used OpenAPI documentation for the formal API contract and added a short integration guide with business explanations and examples. I asked a front-end developer and QA engineer to review the document. Based on their feedback, I added clearer examples for pagination and field-level validation errors. Result: front-end integration became smoother. QA created test scenarios directly from the documentation. The team received fewer repetitive questions, and the API behavior was easier to understand and maintain. Why this answer works? This answer is strong because it shows API documentation, Spring Boot experience, front-end and QA collaboration, request and response examples, error documentation, improved integration efficiency. Example 2. Writing an application setup guide situation. In one project, new developers needed several hours, or sometimes more than a day, to run the application locally. The setup required Java, Maven, Docker, PostgreSQL, environment variables, and multiple dependent services. There was no complete setup guide. Task: I decided to create documentation that allowed new developers to set up the application with fewer questions. Action: I went through the setup process from a clean environment and recorded every required step. The guide included AIM 1. Required Java version, Maven version, Docker installation, database setup, environment variables, local configuration, service startup order, required ports, sample test data, health check URLs, common errors, troubleshooting steps. I added exact commands where useful. I also explained how to verify each step. For example, after starting the database, The guide showed how to confirm the connection before starting the application. I asked a developer who was unfamiliar with the project to follow the guide. When they encountered unclear steps, I updated the document. I also added ownership and a last reviewed date so the guide would not become outdated silently. Result: new developers could run the application much faster. Onboarding questions decreased. The setup guide became the team's standard reference for local development. Why this answer works? This answer is good because it shows: check onboarding documentation, check step-by-step instructions, testing documentation with a real user, troubleshooting guidance, maintainability, reduced onboarding time. Example 3. Writing a production support runbook situation. In one production application, support engineers sometimes needed developer help to investigate common API failures. The team had monitoring dashboards and logs, but there was no clear runbook explaining what to check. Task: I was responsible for creating a production support runbook for common incidents. Action: I reviewed previous production incidents and identified recurring problems. The runbook included: check high API response time, increased error rate, database connection failure, downstream service timeout, Kafka consumer lag, failed batch job, authentication failure, deployment-related issue. For each issue, I documented: click symptoms, possible causes, dashboards to check, log search examples, correlation ID usage, safe diagnostic steps, escalation criteria, rollback or recovery options, responsible team. I separated safe support actions from changes that required developer or production approval. I also avoided including passwords, secrets, or sensitive information. Then I reviewed the runbook with developers, operations, and support teams. Result: support engineers could investigate common incidents more independently. Escalations included better diagnostic information. Production issue resolution became faster because everyone followed a consistent process. Why this answer works? This answer is strong because it shows: click operational documentation, click production support awareness, click incident troubleshooting, click safe escalation process, cross-team collaboration, reduced resolution time. Example 4. Writing architecture documentation situation. In one microservices project, the system had several Spring Boot services, Kafka topics, databases, and external integrations. New developers found it difficult to understand how a user request moved through the system. Task: I created architecture documentation that explained the system at both a high level and a component level. Action: I started by identifying the main audience. Business stakeholders needed a high-level view, while developers and QA needed more technical detail. I created documentation covering system context, major services, service responsibilities, API communication, Kafka event flow, database ownership, external integrations, authentication flow, retry and failure handling, monitoring and logging. I added simple diagrams showing CAP user request flow, synchronous service calls, asynchronous event processing, data ownership, failure and retry paths. For each service, I documented what it owned and what it did not own. I also included links to API specifications, repositories, dashboards, and deployment instructions. I reviewed the diagrams with the team to make sure they matched the actual implementation. Result: new developers understood the system faster. Design discussions became more efficient because the team had a shared architectural reference. The documentation also helped QA understand integration and failure scenarios. Why this answer works? This answer is good because it shows architecture documentation, microservices knowledge, Kafka event flow explanation, audience awareness, diagrams and supporting links, improved shared understanding. Example 5. Writing documentation for a Kafka consumer situation. In one project, our service consumed customer update events from Kafka. The consumer included validation, idempotency, retries, and dead letter queue handling. The behavior was implemented in code, but it was not clearly documented. Task. I needed to document how the consumer worked, so developers, QA, and support teams could understand normal and failure behavior. Action. I documented Kafka topic name, event schema, required fields, optional fields, consumer group, validation rules, idempotency behavior, retry policy, dead letter queue behavior, logging and correlation IDs, monitoring alerts, replay procedure. I added examples for check, successful event, check, duplicate event, check, invalid payload, check, temporary downstream failure, check, permanent processing failure, check, event set to the dead letter queue. I also explained which failures were retried and which were not. For QA, I added test scenarios and expected results. For production support, I added instructions on how to locate failed messages and when to escalate. Result. QA had clearer event processing test cases. Support teams could investigate consumer failures more effectively. Developers also had a reliable reference when changing retry or DLQ behavior. Why this answer works? This answer is strong because it shows Kafka documentation, event-driven architecture, retry and DLQ knowledge, idempotency, QA and support alignment. Example 6. Writing a database migration guide situation. In one release, our application required database schema changes and a migration of existing records. The deployment involved several steps, and performing them in the wrong order could cause application failure or data inconsistency. Task. I was responsible for writing a clear migration and deployment guide. Action. I worked with developers, database administrators, QA, and the release team to confirm the correct sequence. The guide included Kirk, migration prerequisites, Kirk, backup confirmation, Kirk, schema changes, Kirk, data migration script, Kirk, execution order, Kirk, expected record counts, Kirk, validation queries, Kirk, application deployment sequence, Kirk, rollback steps, Kirk, post-deployment checks. I added clear checkpoints. For example, the team had to confirm the schema version and migrated record count before deploying the application. I also documented known edge cases, including invalid records that would be skipped and added to an error report. Before production deployment, we tested the guide in a lower environment. I updated any unclear or missing steps based on that test. Result. The production migration was completed successfully. The release team followed a clear sequence and verified each stage. The rollback and validation instructions also improved release confidence. Why this answer works? This answer is good because it shows key database migration documentation, key deployment planning, key validation queries, key rollback preparation, key cross-functional collaboration, key production risk reduction. Example 7. Writing documentation after a production incident situation. Our team resolved a production incident caused by an optional request field that was not handled safely. Although the bug was fixed, I wanted to make sure the team understood the cause and prevention steps. Task. I wrote an incident document that recorded what happened without blaming individuals. Action. I organized the document into clear sections. The document included incident summary, user impact, detection method, event timeline, root cause, immediate fix, verification steps, contributing factors, prevention actions, responsible owners. I explained the root cause in simple terms. The service assumed that an optional field would always be present, which caused certain requests to fail. I documented prevention actions such as check, improve null-safe handling, add regression tests, review similar request flows, improve alerting, update API documentation, add validation examples. I reviewed the document with the team to confirm accuracy. We then tracked the prevention actions as separate tasks. Result. The team had a shared understanding of the incident. Future developers could learn why the change was made. The prevention tasks reduced the chance of the same issue happening again. Why this answer works. This answer is strong because it shows check. Incident documentation. Check. No blame communication. Check. Root cause explanation. Check. Corrective actions. Production ownership. Check. Organizational learning. Example 8. Writing documentation for a shared development standard situation. In one team, different APIs used different error response formats and logging patterns. This caused confusion for front-end developers, QA, and production support. Task. I helped create a shared technical standard for API errors and logging. Action. I reviewed existing APIs and identified the common needs. For API errors, I documented HTTP status usage, internal error code, user-friendly message, field-level validation errors, timestamp, correlation ID, rules for hiding internal details. For logging, I documented current levels, correlation ID usage, safe business identifiers, exception logging, prohibited sensitive data, structured log fields, example log statements. I included good and bad examples. I also added a small Spring Boot reference implementation so developers could follow the standard instead of interpreting the document differently. I reviewed the standard with developers, QA, security, and support teams. Result. New APIs became more consistent. Front-end and QA teams could handle errors more predictably. Production troubleshooting improved because logs followed a standard structure. Why this answer works. This answer is good because it shows check. Development standards. Check. API error documentation. Check. Secure logging. Check. Reference implementation. Check. Cross-team alignment. Check. Consistency improvement. Best short answer version. If you need a short interview answer, you can say, in one project, our team developed a Spring Boot customer search API that supported filters, pagination, sorting, validation, authorization, and multiple error scenarios. Front-end developers and QA needed clear documentation to integrate with and test the API. I created API documentation that included the endpoint, request parameters, required and optional fields, response format, pagination rules, sorting options, validation behavior, authorization rules, and error codes. I also added sample requests and responses for successful searches, empty results, invalid filters, unauthorized access, and validation errors. I asked a front-end developer and QA engineer to review the document. Based on their feedback, I added clearer examples for pagination and field-level errors. As a result, front-end integration was smoother. QA could create test scenarios directly from the documentation, and the development team received fewer repetitive questions. Common mistakes to avoid. 1. Saying only, I updated the README. Bad answer. I wrote a README for the project. Better answer. Explain what problem the document solved, who used it, what it included, and what improved. 2. Writing documentation only for yourself. Bad answer. I documented the parts I thought were important. Better answer. I identified what developers, QA, support teams, or stakeholders needed to know. 3. Including too much unstructured detail. Bad answer. I wrote everything I knew about the system. Better answer. I organized the document by purpose, audience, workflow, examples, and troubleshooting steps. 4. Not verifying accuracy. Bad answer. I completed the document and shared it. Better answer. I asked someone unfamiliar with the process to follow it and updated unclear steps. 5. Allowing documentation to become outdated. Bad answer. The document was correct when I created it. Better answer. I added ownership, review dates, and links to the documentation from related stories and pull requests. Best practices for answering this question. Pellet. Use the STAR method. Explain why documentation was needed. Identify the intended audience. Organize the information clearly. Include practical examples. Add diagrams when they improve understanding. Include troubleshooting steps. Ask others to review or test the document. Keep sensitive information out. Explain how the documentation was maintained. Check. End with a measurable team benefit. What interviewers are looking for. Interviewers want to see whether you can communicate technical information clearly, understand your audience, organize complex information, support onboarding, reduce repeated questions, improve maintainability, document operational procedures, share knowledge across the team, take ownership beyond writing code. For senior roles, they also want to see architecture communication, production runbook ownership, documentation standards, cross-team knowledge sharing, long-term maintainability thinking, reduction of key person dependency, technical leadership. Strong words to use in your answer. You can use words like documented, organized, clarified, standardized, reviewed, validated, illustrated, maintained, simplified, created examples, added troubleshooting steps, reduced onboarding time, improved knowledge sharing. Example: I wrote the documentation by first identifying the audience, organizing the content around common workflows, adding practical examples and troubleshooting steps, and asking another team member to validate it. Good technical documentation topics you can use. Depending on your experience, you can talk about REST API documentation, local application setup guide, production support runbook, architecture documentation, Kafka consumer documentation, database migration guide, incident report, API error handling standard, secure logging standard, deployment guide, onboarding guide, troubleshooting guide, integration contract, batch job support guide, monitoring and alerting guide, proof of concept findings. Final summary. Tell me about a time you wrote technical documentation is an important interview question because software engineering depends on clear knowledge sharing, not only code. The best answer should include capital, why documentation was needed, capital, who the audience was, capital, your responsibility, capital, how you organize the content, capital, what examples or diagrams you included, capital, how you verified accuracy, capital, how you kept it maintainable, what result improved. Good examples include, API documentation, setup guide, production runbook, architecture documentation, Kafka documentation, migration guide, incident documentation, shared development standard. The strongest answers show clarity, ownership, audience awareness, maintainability, and measurable improvement in team efficiency.